June 6th, 1944. 5 a.m. The binoculars trembled. Not from fear, not yet, but from the cold. Oberleutnant Walter Olmsen's hands were steady, his breathing controlled, his eyes trained on the horizon where the English Channel met the pre-dawn sky. Then the light changed. Dawn didn't break over Normandy that morning. It revealed. And what it revealed made Olmsen's breath catch in his throat. Where the ocean should have been, where yesterday there had been nothing but empty water stretching to England, there was now steel, a wall of it, a continent of it, ships, thousands of ships, battleships with turrets like cathedral spires, cruisers bristling with guns, destroyers cutting white wakes through the grey water, and behind them, an endless procession of flat-bottomed landing craft, transport vessels, and ships whose purpose Olmsen couldn't even identify. He blinked, adjusted the focus. The image didn't change. The fleet stretched from his left periphery to his right, horizon to horizon, a solid line of dark hulls merging into one continuous mass. He tried to count them, 1, 5, 10, 20, but they blurred together. Hundreds became thousands. The math became impossible. 6,939 vessels. He didn't know that number yet. He would learn it later, read it in captured documents, see it in after-action reports. But standing in his observation post atop Crisbeck Battery, watching the grey dawn illuminate the largest invasion fleet in human history, Olmsen didn't need precise figures. He needed only his eyes. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. Mein Gott, someone whispered behind him. Olmsen lowered the binoculars. His hands were shaking now. Not from cold, but from the weight of what he was seeing. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a feint. This wasn't the 3,000-ship fleet intelligence had predicted. This was an industrial verdict. The Führer had promised them the Allies were weak, decadent, incapable of mounting a serious threat. Olmsen had believed it because he'd been trained to believe it, because the propaganda said it, because every briefing reinforced it. Now he understood. They had lied, or worse, they had been wrong. At 5:52 a.m., the field telephone rang. Feuer frei, fire at will. Olmsen gave the order. At 5:55 a.m., the first shell left the barrel of his 210mm Skoda cannon, with a sound like thunder tearing the sky apart. He watched through his rangefinder as it arced over the water, a single projectile against an ocean of ships. It struck something. He thought it was a destroyer, maybe a cruiser, and a small plume of smoke rose. Then the ship kept moving, and behind it, 10 more appeared. Behind those, 100 more. Behind those, 1,000 more. Olmsen fired again, and again. His battery engaged the USS Tuscaloosa, then the USS Quincy, then the battleship USS Nevada, her 14-inch guns already rotating toward his position. Each hit felt like a victory. Each victory felt meaningless, because for every ship his guns damaged, the horizon birthed replacements. The fleet wasn't arriving. It was materializing, an endless conveyor belt of steel rolling out of the fog, out of the darkness, out of the industrial capacity of a nation Olmsen had been told could never build something like this. At 6:30 a.m., his battery scored its greatest success. The destroyer USS Corrie broke apart and sank. The only American destroyer lost on D-Day. Olmsen watched it go down. Then he turned his binoculars back to the horizon. The fleet hadn't shrunk, it had grown. The sea had turned to steel, and Germany had nothing that could stop it. 50 miles from Olmson's battery, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not at his post. He was in Germany, at his home in Herrlingen, carrying a pair of handmade shoes, a birthday gift for his wife Lucy, who was turning 50 on June 6th. The Desert Fox, the man who had commanded respect from both sides in North Africa, had looked at the weather reports on June 5th and made a calculation. The seas were too rough, the winds too strong, the cloud cover too thick. No invasion could come in this weather. It was the kind of tactical judgment Rommel had made 1,000 times before, logical, reasonable, based on experience. And it was catastrophically wrong. The same weather that convinced Rommel the invasion was impossible had convinced General Dwight Eisenhower it was just barely possible. The Allies had gambled, the Germans had assumed. At Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, received the first reports at 1:20 a.m. Massive parachute drops across Normandy, thousands of paratroopers falling through the darkness. Speidel was competent, methodical, a staff officer trained in Prussian efficiency. But he was also bound by the assumptions that had shaped German planning for months. This couldn't be the main invasion. The weather was wrong. The location was wrong. The intelligence was wrong. German naval intelligence had predicted the Allies might, at maximum capacity, assemble 3,000 vessels for an invasion attempt, perhaps 20 divisions, maybe 50,000 troops in the initial wave. These were not wild guesses. They were calculations based on Germany's own experience, their own limitations, their own understanding of what was possible. After 5 years of total war, Germany knew the cost of building ships, training soldiers, manufacturing equipment. They had done the math. They had assumed the Allies were doing the same math. They were wrong. The Allies weren't limited by what Germany thought was possible. They were limited only by what American and British factories could produce. And those factories had been running 3 shifts a day for 3 years. But the deepest flaw in German planning wasn't mathematical. It was psychological. They were fighting the last war. German doctrine had been forged in 1940, refined in Russia, hardened by experience. They knew how to fight. They knew how invasions worked. They knew the patterns, the rhythms, the possibilities. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that the Allies had rewritten the rules. And then there was Operation Fortitude. The deception had worked so perfectly that even as Olmson watched 7,000 ships approach Normandy, German high command still believed this was a feint. The real invasion, the main thrust, would come at Pas-de-Calais, 150 miles northeast, where the channel was narrowest. General George S. Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group was supposedly massing there. 50 divisions, 1,000 tanks, ready to strike at the Reich's industrial heartland. None of it existed. But German reserves, entire panzer divisions, remained frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never come. At 5:55 a.m., as Olmson's first shells arced toward the invasion fleet, the phone lines from Normandy to Berlin carried increasingly frantic reports. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of troops, the sky black with aircraft. In Berlin, the officers receiving these reports checked them against intelligence estimates. The numbers didn't make sense, so they assumed the reports were exaggerated, the fog of war, the panic of frontline troops, the confusion of first contact. They filed the reports, made notes, waited for clarification. And while they waited, 156,000 Allied soldiers poured onto the beaches of Normandy. The false confidence wasn't just a mistake. It was a structural failure, a complete inability to comprehend that the enemy had become something Germany could no longer measure by its own standards. By the time German High Command understood the truth, the war was already over. They just didn't know it yet. At 5:30 a.m., the mathematics of industrial war began. The naval bombardment opened not with a single salvo, but with a symphony of destruction conducted across 50 miles of coastline. 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, 2 monitors. The numbers were not just impressive, they were impossible by German standards. The USS Texas, a battleship commissioned in 1914 and modernized for this war, trained her 10 14-inch guns on the cliffs above Omaha Beach. Each gun could fire a 1,400-pound shell 20 miles inland, with accuracy measured in yards. In the first hour, she fired 255 rounds. Do the math, 255 shells, 1,400 pounds each. That's 357,000 pounds of high explosives, 178 tons, delivered by a single ship in 60 minutes, more than many German artillery regiments possessed in their entire ammunition stockpiles. And the Texas was just one ship. HMS Warspite, a British battleship that had fought at Jutland in 1916, added her 8 15-inch guns. Each shell weighed 1,138 pounds. Each impact created a crater 30 feet wide. Before the first soldier stepped onto the beaches, before the first landing craft touched sand, the Allied naval forces had fired approximately 50,000 destroyer shells, 23,000 cruiser shells, and 3,500 battleship rounds. 130,000 tons of naval ordnance, dropped on a coastline Germany had spent 4 years fortifying. In 90 minutes. General d'Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lô, listened to the reports coming in from his forward observation posts. A veteran who had lost his leg at Stalingrad, Marx understood firepower. He had survived Soviet artillery barrages on the Eastern Front, bombardments that lasted hours, that pulverized entire divisions. This was different. This wasn't artillery. This was industrial demolition. Then the sky filled. At 6 a.m., as the naval guns continued their methodical destruction, German observers looked up and saw the second demonstration of Allied industrial superiority. Aircraft, thousands of them. Allied air forces flew 14,624 sorties on D-Day. Bombers, fighters, transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft, an aerial armada that blacked out the sun in some sectors. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, the force that had leveled Rotterdam and blitzed London, managed 319 sorties, total, for the entire day, across all of France. The ratio was 46-1. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft. Major Josef Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, made the Luftwaffe's only meaningful attack on the invasion beaches that morning. With just his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, he strafed Sword Beach once, a single pass, guns blazing, defiance in the face of mathematical impossibility. Then he fled from the swarm of Allied fighters that rose to meet him. 2 German planes against an air force that owned the sky. The numbers didn't describe superiority. They described a different category of warfare entirely. This wasn't air support. This was air dominance, so complete, so overwhelming, that German daylight movement would become suicidal within hours. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, Rommel's naval advisor, would later write in his memoirs, "We had prepared to fight an invasion. We found ourselves fighting an industrial system. Every ship we damaged was replaced. Every plane we shot down reappeared in doubled numbers. It was not a battle. It was arithmetic." From his bunker at Omaha Beach, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh watched the naval shells impact the bluffs above him, each explosion shaking the concrete, each blast closer than the last. He had an MG-42 machine gun, 12,000 rounds of ammunition, and excellent fields of fire. He thought he could hold. Then he looked at the horizon and understood what Olmsen had understood at dawn. This wasn't about German skill or courage or tactical excellence. This was about factories. American factories that ran 24 hours a day. British shipyards that launched vessels by the dozen. Assembly lines that produced aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. The Allies hadn't just brought an invasion force. They had brought their entire industrial economy and dropped it on the beaches of Normandy. 130,000 tons of explosives before breakfast. The war wasn't being fought, it was being manufactured. And Germany couldn't compete with that. 30 a.m. The first wave hit the beach and died. Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh, manning MG-42 machine gun at Widerstandsnest 62, Resistance Nest 62, on the bluffs above Omaha Beach, pressed the trigger and didn't let go. The MG-42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute. So fast the sound wasn't individual shots, but a continuous roar. A zipper of death that German soldiers called Hitler's buzzsaw. Severloh had 12,000 rounds. He intended to use them all. Below him, American soldiers from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stumbled off landing craft into chest-deep water. Some were hit before they cleared the ramps. Others made it 3 steps, 5 steps, 10. None made it far. The German 352nd Infantry Division had positioned their defenses with Prussian precision, interlocking fields of fire, enfilading angles, machine guns in concrete bunkers that could sweep the entire beach. Mortars pre-registered on every approach. Artillery zeroed on the waterline. This was what German tactical doctrine looked like when executed perfectly. The beach turned red. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men crawled toward obstacles that offered no protection. Officers died trying to rally their troops. Entire units were pinned down in the first minute, unable to advance, unable to retreat, caught in a killing zone that had been mathematically designed for maximum lethality. For 2 hours, it looked like the Atlantic Wall might hold. Severloh fired until his barrel glowed red-hot, changed barrels, fired again. He later estimated he killed over 1,000 men that morning, a claim historians still debate, but one thing is certain. His gun never stopped. At Widerstandsnest 61, Widerstandsnest 62, Widerstandsnest 72, at every strong point along the bluffs, German machine gunners performed with devastating efficiency. This was German skill, German training, German tactical excellence honed over 5 years of war. And then the destroyers came. At approximately 8 a.m., with the situation on Omaha Beach critical, with General Omar Bradley aboard the USS Augusta, considering evacuation, something unprecedented happened. American destroyers charged the beach. USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, USS Frankfurt. They ignored doctrine, ignored the risk of grounding, ignored the mines, the obstacles, the shallow water that could rip open their hulls. They closed to 1,000 yards from shore, point-blank range. From his position, Severloh watched the destroyers approach, grey shapes cutting through the smoke, their 5-inch guns rotating toward his bunker. He fired at them. Useless. Small arms against warships. Then the destroyers fired back. The first salvo missed his bunker by 20 feet. The explosion was so loud, it felt like the world was ending. Concrete dust filled the air. His ears rang. He couldn't hear his own gun firing anymore. The second salvo hit Widerstandsnest 61. Direct hit. The bunker, reinforced concrete, steel doors, designed to withstand anything, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there. The next moment it was a crater. USS McCook put 17 5-inch shells into Widerstandsnest 65 in 4 minutes. USS Frankfurt fired so close to shore she scraped her keel on the sandy bottom. Didn't matter, she kept firing. Each gun crew could see their targets. German bunkers, German machine guns, German soldiers with their naked eyes. At that range, they couldn't miss. This was the moment German tactical excellence died on Omaha Beach. Not because the defenders weren't skilled, not because they weren't brave, not because their positions weren't expertly designed, but because skill means nothing when a destroyer parks offshore and drops 60-pound shells directly on your position. The USS Corrie had been sunk that morning by Olmson's battery. One destroyer lost. 4 more took her place. Germany treated ships like precious, irreplaceable assets, because for them they were. America treated ships like tools, expendable, replaceable. The mathematics were simple. Germany had positioned its best troops in its best defensive positions with its best weapons. America had brought more ships than Germany could sink, more planes than Germany could shoot down, and more shells than Germany could survive. By 10 a.m., Severlow's MG-42 fell silent. Not because he'd run out of ammunition, but because there was nothing left to shoot from. The bunker was gone. The strong point was gone. The Atlantic Wall, at least here at Omaha, was gone. Erased by industrial firepower, delivered at suicidal range by crews who knew more destroyers were already being built back home. Skill had lost to industry, and it wasn't even close. The landing craft kept coming. That was what broke the German defenders psychologically, not the initial assault, not the naval bombardment, not even the tactical defeats at individual strong points. It was the fact that the landing craft never stopped. Wave after wave after wave. An endless conveyor belt of men and steel flowing from sea to shore with the mechanical inevitability of an assembly line, which, in a sense, it was. At 7 a.m., the second wave landed. At 7:30 a.m., the third. At 8 a.m., the fourth. Every 30 minutes, like clockwork, more landing craft ground onto the beaches, ramps dropped, and soldiers poured out. German observers who had counted the initial assault and calculated how long before the Allies exhausted their reserves found their math becoming meaningless. There were no reserves. There was only production. By noon, landing ship tanks, LSTs, began beaching themselves directly on the sand. These vessels were 328 feet long, displacing 4,000 tons fully loaded, and they were never designed to be elegant. They were designed to be functional. Bow doors opened, ramps descended, and entire tank companies drove off. 30 Sherman tanks per ship, engines roaring, treads grinding, rolling directly from ship to battlefield without pause. The Germans watched Shermans multiply like a mathematical problem that had no solution. One LST beached, 30 tanks, another LST, 30 more tanks, another. By nightfall, 1,700 tanks had landed on the beaches of Normandy. The entire German 7th Army defending Normandy had fewer than 500 operational tanks. The Allies had landed more armor in one day than Germany had in the entire theater. But the tanks were just the beginning. WWII amphibious trucks, ducks, swam directly from transport ships to shore, drove up the beaches, and delivered ammunition, fuel, and supplies to forward units. No port required, no offloading delays. The supply chain had been amphibious engineered. 20,000 vehicles landed in 24 hours. Jeeps, trucks, half-track, bulldozers, cranes, mobile repair shops, field kitchens. Everything an army needed, delivered not in weeks or months, but in hours. This wasn't an invasion. This was industrial logistics, performing at a scale that rewrote military doctrine. From his command post, General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, watched reports pile up on his desk. Each report brought impossible numbers: more troops, more vehicles, more supplies. He tried to calculate the Allied supply line, how long before they outran their logistics, when the offensive would stall, where the breaking point would come. But the breaking point never came, because the Allies hadn't extended a supply line from England. They had transported the supply line itself. Ships that functioned as mobile warehouses, amphibious vehicles that eliminated choke points, prefabricated docks that could be assembled in hours. By 6 p.m., 156,000 troops had landed, 132,715 by sea, 23,400 by air. That number exceeded the entire German 7th Army's strength in Normandy. In one day, the Allies had landed more soldiers than Germany had defending an entire region, and they were still coming. The beach traffic was so dense that military police had to establish traffic control points. Ships queued offshore, waiting their turn to beach. Landing craft circled like taxis waiting for passengers. This was the weapon Germany had no counter for. Not the battleships, not the aircraft, not even the tanks. It was the logistics, the unglamorous, mechanical, relentless mathematics of supply that turned men and material into combat power faster than Germany could destroy it. A German panzer might kill 5 Shermans. Then 10 more Shermans would arrive. A German machine gunner might kill 100 soldiers. Then 1,000 more would land. Every asset Germany destroyed was replaced before the wreckage stopped burning. General Major Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Infantry Division, sent a message to headquarters at 8 p.m. Enemy forces continue landing without pause. Estimate division strength now facing 3 times our numbers. Request reinforcements. The response came an hour later. No reinforcements available. Hold position. Richter looked at his map, at the red arrows showing Allied advances, at the blue markers showing his own dwindling units. He understood then what Olmsen had understood at dawn, what Severloh had understood when the destroyers came, what every German commander would eventually understand. They weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting an industrial system that produced combat power faster than courage could resist it. The landing craft kept coming, and Germany had nothing that could stop them. The 21st Panzer Division began its counterattack at 4 p.m. It was the only armored unit close enough to strike on D-Day itself. 127 tanks, including 40 Panzerfours, positioned near Caen. These were experienced crews, veterans of North Africa and the Eastern Front, men who understood armored warfare. The division had 10 miles to travel. It took 3 hours, not because of enemy resistance, not because of terrain, but because moving in daylight had become a death sentence. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, patrolled the skies in hunting packs. Any vehicle that moved, any column that formed, any concentration of troops that gathered, became a target within minutes. Radio intercepts were triangulated. Forward observers called in strikes. Cab ranks of aircraft circled overhead, waiting for targets like hawks over a field. The 21st Panzer lost 17 tanks before it reached the battlefield. Not to enemy tanks, not to anti-tank guns, but to rockets and bombs from aircraft they never saw coming. SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, watched his supply column burn from airstrikes and understood what the textbooks had never taught him. Armor means nothing when the enemy owns the sky. We were moving in broad daylight, he would later write, and it was like marching naked. When the surviving panzers finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they encountered something worse than aircraft. Naval gunfire. HMS Warspite, positioned 15 miles offshore, had forward observers with the British infantry. When the panzers appeared, the observers radioed coordinates. 4 minutes later, 15-inch shells began landing. Each shell weighed 1,838 pounds. Each shell carried 224 pounds of high explosives. Each shell could penetrate 3 feet of reinforced concrete, or go through any tank ever built like it was made of paper. The panzers scattered. Some retreated. Others tried to advance through the barrage. None succeeded. Oberstleutnant Hermann von Oppeln-Bronikowski, leading the 22nd Panzer Regiment, gave the order to withdraw at 9 p.m. His after-action report was clinical in its despair. Enemy material superiority renders maneuver impossible. Air supremacy absolute. Naval gunfire extends 20 kilometers inland. Recommend no further daylight operations. That last line was the breaking point. The German army, the force that had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and pushed to the gates of Moscow, was being told it could no longer move during daylight. At Panzer Group West Headquarters, General der Panzertruppe Leo Geyer von Schweppenburg studied reconnaissance photographs taken on June 7th. The photos showed Allied ships unloading supplies on the beaches, hundreds of vehicles moving inland, tank columns advancing, and in the background, being built in the open ocean, two massive artificial harbors. The Mulberry harbors. Von Schweppenburg had the photographs analyzed 3 times because he didn't believe them. Britain had prefabricated 2 entire ports, 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, towed them across the English Channel, and were now assembling them like furniture. Within 2 weeks, those harbors would handle 9,000 tons of supplies daily. More than Cherbourg. More than Le Havre. More than any natural port in Normandy. Germany had spent 4 years fortifying the ports, assuming the Allies would need to capture them. The Allies had eliminated the requirement for ports entirely. Von Schweppenburg set down the photographs and did something rare for a German general. He spoke the truth aloud. "This is unwinnable." His chief of staff looked up, startled. "Not this battle," von Schweppenburg continued. "The war. If they can build harbors from nothing, transport entire armies in a day, and replace losses faster than we can inflict them, what can we do? How do we fight that?" Silence, because there was no answer. At Army Group B headquarters, Hans Speidel received reports throughout June 7th. Each report brought worse news. Allied beachheads expanding, German counterattacks failing, reserves unable to move, the Luftwaffe absent, naval gunfire dominating the battlefield. He compiled the reports into a summary for Rommel, who had finally returned from Germany. "Enemy has established air and naval supremacy. Ground forces outnumber ours 3-1 and reinforcing faster than we can respond. Daylight movement impossible. Panzer reserves delayed by air attack. Recommend..." He stopped. Recommend what? Surrender? Retreat? Admit defeat? Rommel read the report in silence. Then he looked at Speidel and said what every German commander was beginning to understand. "We are not fighting soldiers anymore. We are fighting factories. And you cannot win against factories with courage." The breaking point wasn't a single moment. It was a realization that spread like a virus through the German command structure, infecting every level with the same cold truth. This war was already over. They just didn't know how to stop fighting it. The war was over before the first shot was fired on D-Day. Not because of tactics, not because of courage, not because of German mistakes or Allied brilliance, because of numbers. Cold, industrial, unavoidable numbers. In 1944, the United States produced 96,218 aircraft. Germany produced 39,807. The Americans built more than 2 aircraft for every one Germany manufactured. And that was just the United States. Add British production, Canadian production, Soviet production, and the ratio became absurd. But aircraft were just the beginning. In 1944, American factories produced 29,497 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany produced 27,300, nearly equal Except for one critical difference. Germany was fighting on 3 fronts. The Americans were supplying 2 of those fronts, while barely touching their industrial capacity. The real disparity showed in logistics. In 1944, the United States manufactured 650,000 trucks. Germany built 68,000. Trucks, the unglamorous backbone of modern war. The difference between an army that could move and an army that was stranded. Germany couldn't move its panzer divisions to Normandy fast enough because it didn't have enough trucks to transport fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The Americans drove their supplies directly off LSTs onto the beaches. The math was simple. 650,000 Dutters versus 68,000. A 9.5 to 1 advantage in the single most important logistical asset of mechanized warfare. Steel production revealed the deeper truth. In 1944, the United States produced 89.6 million tons of steel. Germany produced 28.5 million tons. Britain added another 12.3 million tons. The Soviet Union contributed 10.9 million. Combined Allied steel production, 112.8 million tons. Germany, 28.5 million tons. A 4 to 1 disadvantage in the fundamental material of modern war. Every ship, every tank, every gun, every shell, all steel, and Germany was producing less than 1/4 of what the Allies manufactured. The industrial disparity extended to every category. Oil production, United States, 4.7 million barrels per day. Germany, 124,000 barrels per day, including synthetic production. Aluminum, United States, 920,000 tons. Germany, 245,000 tons. Merchant shipping, Allies built, 12.4 million tons in 1944. Germany destroyed, 1.4 million tons. The Allies built ships 8 times faster than Germany could sink them. General der Artillerie, Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, compiled these statistics in a classified report in July 1944. His conclusion was clinical. The Reich faces an industrial disparity of approximately 5:1 in overall production capacity. This ratio is insurmountable through tactical or operational excellence. Material inferiority of this magnitude cannot be compensated by morale, training, or defensive advantages. The report was filed and never acted upon, because what action could be taken? You cannot decree factories into existence. You cannot wish oil wells into production. You cannot inspire steel mills to double their output through ideology. At Berchtesgaden, Adolf Hitler reviewed casualty reports and demanded his generals explain how the invasion had succeeded. The generals tried. They cited Allied air superiority, naval gunfire, deception operations, weather, tactical errors, all true, all irrelevant. The real answer was simpler and more devastating. In 1944, the United States, alone, had an economy twice the size of Germany's. Add Britain, Canada, and the industrial resources they brought, and the disparity became 3.1. Add the Soviet Union, and it became 5:1. Germany was not fighting nations. It was fighting economic systems, factories, assembly lines, supply chains that produced combat power faster than German courage could resist it. General Major Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, understood the mathematics. In his diary on June 10, 1944, he wrote a single line that captured the essence of Germany's strategic position. We counted divisions, they counted factories. That was the war in one sentence. Germany had better tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, better machine guns, the MG-42, better individual soldiers, veterans hardened by 5 years of war. None of it mattered, because for every Panther Germany built, America built 5 Shermans. For every veteran Germany trained, the Allies trained 10 replacements. For every shell Germany fired, Allied factories produced 100 more. The mathematics were final. Germany wasn't beaten on the beaches of Normandy. It was beaten in the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, Birmingham, and Manchester. The invasion was just the delivery system. The verdict had been written in production statistics years earlier. Germany had lost the war in 1942, when American industry shifted to total war production. Everything after that was just arithmetic. Cold, industrial, unavoidable arithmetic. And mathematics doesn't care about courage. The lesson came slowly, painfully, like a truth too large to accept all at once. German officers had been raised in a tradition that valued warrior spirit, tactical excellence, operational brilliance. They had studied Clausewitz, memorized Schlieffen, absorbed the lessons of Frederick the Great and von Moltke. They believed, had been trained to believe, that wars were won by superior doctrine, better leadership, and the will to prevail. D-Day shattered that belief permanently. Standing in the ruins of his headquarters on June 12th, General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, dictated a message to Berlin that would never appear in official Wehrmacht records, but would circulate among senior officers as an epitaph for German military theory. We were taught that modern war is a clash of wills. We have discovered it is a comparison of production schedules. The ideology had been a lie, not a deliberate deception, but something worse, a comfortable delusion. Nazi propaganda had assured German officers that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice, that British industrial capacity was exhausted, that willpower and racial superiority would overcome material disadvantages. Every part of it was wrong. The Americans weren't soft, they were pragmatic. They didn't glorify war, they industrialized it. They didn't worship martial tradition, they built assembly lines. And those assembly lines had won. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment, sat in a farmhouse in Normandy and wrote a letter he would never send. We counted divisions, they counted factories. We calculated how many tanks we could destroy. They calculated how many tanks they could build. We thought in terms of battles. They thought in terms of supply chains. We were fighting the wrong war. That realization, that fundamental misunderstanding of what modern warfare had become, spread through the German officer corps like a virus in the weeks after D-Day. War had evolved beyond them. It was no longer an art. It had become a science, an industrial science where victory went not to the most skilled, but to the most productive. The Allies had rewritten the equation. Courage was a constant. Training was a constant. Tactical excellence was a constant. The variables that mattered now were production capacity, logistical throughput, and industrial base. Germany had optimized for the wrong variables. They had built Panther tanks with sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm guns, technological marvels that required 55,000 man-hours to manufacture. The Americans had built Sherman tanks with adequate armor and adequate guns that required 10,000 man-hours to manufacture. Germany produced 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. America produced 50,000 Shermans. The mathematics were brutal. 5 adequate tanks beat 1 superior tank. Every time. This was the final lesson, the one that military academies would study for generations. Modern industrial war is won in factories, not on battlefields. Battles determine where you lose. Factories determine whether you lose. And Germany had lost in the factories years before D-Day proved it. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, who had watched the invasion from Rommel's headquarters, wrote in his memoir a passage that became infamous among military historians. June 6, 1944, was not the day Germany began to lose the war. It was the day we could no longer pretend we hadn't already lost. The Americans didn't defeat us with superior tactics or better soldiers. They defeated us with something we had no counter for, an economy that treated war as a production problem. And they solved that problem with the same efficiency they built automobiles. That was the revelation that haunted German officers for the rest of their lives. They hadn't been outfought. They'd been outproduced. Courage, skill, tactical brilliance, all the virtues German military tradition celebrated, had been rendered obsolete by American industrial capacity. The Allies had brought a new kind of war to Normandy. Not a war of glory or honor or martial valor, but a war of spreadsheets and assembly lines and logistics networks. A war where the side with more factories, more oil, more steel, and more trucks would win regardless of tactical genius. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't inspiring, but it was final. War had become an industrial science, and Germany had been calculated out of existence. The battlefields of Normandy weren't where Germany lost. They were just where Germany discovered it had already been defeated. By economics, by production tables, by the cold mathematics of industrial capacity. The ideology that promised German superiority had collided with the reality of Allied industry, and reality had won. It always does. June 6, 1984. The bunker was still there, weathered now, concrete crumbling at the edges, metal rusting in the salt air, but recognizable. The same observation post where Oberleutnant Walter Olmsen had stood 40 years earlier and watched the world change. He was 72 now. The hands that had trembled holding the binoculars in 1944 were steady again, steadied by age and acceptance. He climbed the steps slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, and stood where he had stood 4 decades before. The English Channel stretched before him, grey-green and empty. No ships, no armada, just water and horizon. But he could still see them. 6,939 vessels. A steel continent materializing out of the dawn. The image had never left him. Not in the chaos of the retreat through France. Not in the prisoner of war camps. Not in the quiet decades of rebuilding that followed. He had tried to explain it to his grandchildren once. How it felt to see that fleet. To understand in a single moment that everything you believed was wrong. They had listened politely, the way young people do when old men tell war stories, but they hadn't understood. How could they? They had grown up in a world shaped by what happened here. A world where American industrial capacity was taken for granted, where military might was measured in GDP and manufacturing output, where everyone understood that modern war was won in factories. In 1944, that had been a revelation. A German tourist couple approached, cameras around their necks, guidebook in hand. They didn't recognize him. Why would they? Just another old man visiting a historical site. They asked if he'd take their photograph. He did. They thanked him in German and moved on, leaving him alone with the ghosts. Olmsen thought about the order he'd given at 5:55 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Fire at will. He remembered the satisfaction of seeing the first shell strike home. The brief, foolish hope that his guns might matter. Then the horizon had continued producing ships, and he'd understood. He had killed men that morning, sunk the USS Corrie, damaged other vessels, done his duty as he understood it. But even as he'd fired, even as he'd fought, he had known the fundamental truth. None of it mattered. Not his skill, not his courage, not the excellent German guns or the well-designed defenses or the tactical brilliance of the 352nd Infantry Division. Because weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. That was the sentence that had stayed with him for 40 years. The thought that had come to him unbidden as he watched the armada approach, and had returned again and again in the decades since. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. They don't produce 96,000 aircraft in a single year. They don't manufacture 650,000 trucks. They don't create artificial harbors from nothing and tow them across an ocean. Strong nations do. And Germany, despite all its military tradition, despite all its tactical excellence, despite all its ideology of superiority, had not been strong in the way that mattered in 1944. The Americans hadn't defeated Germany with better soldiers. They'd defeated Germany with better factories. That was the truth D-Day had taught him. War wasn't about glory anymore. It wasn't about martial valor or warrior spirit or any of the things he'd been taught to revere. It was about steel production and oil reserves and industrial capacity. It was about mathematics. Cold, final, unavoidable mathematics. Olmsson stood at the bunker's edge and looked out at the empty channel one last time. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, the USS Corrie still lay on the bottom. The destroyer his battery had sunk. His small victory in an unwinnable war. One ship against 7,000. He turned and walked away from the bunker, back toward the parking lot where his car waited. His war was over. Had been over for 40 years, but the lesson remained. Permanent, universal, eternal. In modern war, factories beat courage every time. The Allies had known it, Germany had learned it, and the world would never forget it. The English Channel was empty now, peaceful under an overcast sky. But Olmsson could still see them, all 7,000 ships, stretching to the horizon. The industrial verdict, the mathematics of defeat, the moment when ideology met reality, and reality won, always.